Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 293, Sean Strickland defeated Israel Adesanya to become the new UFC middleweight champion. And as soon as the decision was read, there was people already debating about whether or not there should be an immediate rematch. Should the UFC make Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya 2? And Dana White even made some comments at the post-fight presser. We'll discuss that later in the video. But I'm going to discuss my opinion on what I think should be next for Sean Strickland and the middleweight division. I'm going to discuss what I think the UFC is actually going to do because it differs from what I actually want. And I'm also really going to enjoy discussing a certain topic in this video because we are going to expose a massive hypocrisy among the MMA community regarding undeserved title shots in the UFC that's been running rampant, it seems, in 2023. And we're also going to talk about Dricus Du Plessis and how he potentially made a massive mistake not taking the fight injured at UFC 293, but we'll discuss that later in the video. What happened at UFC 293? I did an in-depth breakdown of the main event as well as a full card post-fight. I will link both of those down in the description if you want to go check them out after this. But Sean Strickland won a very clear-cut, uncontroversial decision against Israel Adesanya. The judges scored it 49-46. That was in line with the scorecards that I had. I had rounds 1 and then 3 through 5 scored for Sean Strickland. 1, he hurts Adesanya badly, almost finishes him. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but he really swarmed him after he hurt him badly. Clearly won that round. Second round, I scored it for Adesanya, but it was a close round. I even would be sympathetic to an argument saying maybe Strickland won the second round, but I thought round 2 was pretty clear for Adesanya. And then the rest of the rounds were just Adesanya backing up against the fence and Strickland landing his jab and avoiding some of the leg kicks from Israel Adesanya. So as far as clear-cut decisions go, this was so clear-cut because a lot of the time when you have speculation about immediate rematches, you have some type of fluke or some type of quick finish or a fight where you have a champion who's winning and then loses last second. Like you go back and you look, Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 2 last year. Kamaru Usman was clearly winning. He was a dominant champion and then he gets finished in the last minute of the 5th round. Of course, we're going to see an immediate rematch, and that's kind of the scenarios where we usually get them. Or even if Sean Strickland would have finished him in that first round exchange, I think that would have been a good case to be made. Okay, someone zigged when they should have zagged, and let's see who's really the better fighter, even though this fighter clearly won. But really, you don't have that case to be made here. You really don't, because Sean Strickland went out there and won 4 out of 5 rounds pretty decisively. There wasn't an injury that we know of, at least. There wasn't a significant injury obtained in the fight. Whether Adesanya came in injured or not, that's something we'll maybe talk about in this video, but it was pretty clear. There's nothing you can really point to and say, oh, well, if it wasn't for this, Adesanya would have won. If it wasn't for that, Strickland would have had no chance. Whatever it may be, whatever excuse it may be, there's really not that one excuse to point to where the UFC can point to, the fans can point to and say, well, I'd be really compelled to see this rematch. I would be really compelled to see this ran back. And that really had me thinking about this fight because I knew people, if Adesanya lost this fight in any capacity, I knew in the lead into this fight, I knew some people would be clamoring for a rematch, and I knew some people would be saying, no way Israel Adesanya deserves a rematch. No matter how it happened, Israel Adesanya just lost his belt 2 fights ago, just got it back in his last fight. He lost again. There ain't no way he deserves a rematch. Now, my opinion on this is pretty much in line with that opinion because for me, the reason you do an immediate rematch is because there's some type of controversy or you have a champion who was so dominant over so many years and then all of a sudden they get finished in the first round or it's a fight that they're winning. And I understand that Israel Adesanya technically lost his belt 2 fights ago and then regained it in his last fight. I still consider him in a way a long reigning champion and I do respect the resume, and I do understand there is kind of an argument to be made that Adesanya's done so much and he's been so active, and when he first won the middleweight title, he defended it a bunch of times, and he has a big win against Alex Pereira in his last fight, and he looked a little bit off in this fight. I am a little bit sympathetic to that argument, but for me personally, the biggest reason I ever want to see an immediate rematch is because I think the outcome will be different. I always want, regardless, some people say, oh, you're a fanboy of this guy, you hate this guy. I always want to see whoever I believe is the better fighter in that fight, when we actually watch it and it actually happens, I want to see that person win. That's why I hate bad decisions. And clearly at UFC 293, the better guy won, and that was Sean Strickland. And watching that fight, I don't have any reason to believe that it will be different the next time around. I mean, I still think it's a mildly interesting fight because maybe Adesanya had an injury, came into the fight. Maybe there's some excuse that we don't know about that maybe he doesn't want to share because it's just going to look like an excuse, which it will be. So maybe there is some type of backstory that we haven't heard of, but we don't know what that could be. So for me, just seeing what we saw in the main event of UFC 293, and then you add in all the context of, well, Adesanya lost to Pereira at 281, November of last year. Adesanya's lost 2 out of his last 3 fights now. And you have a blooming middleweight division. A lot of people call the middleweight division garbage. And I've been saying literally for years that it's not the best division, but divisions look worse when you have a dominant champion or a long reigning champion. And now all of a sudden the middleweight division doesn't look so bad. Now all of a sudden you have all these different matchups of combinations of Israel Adesanya, Khamzat Chimaev, Dricus Du Plessis, and Sean Strickland, and even Paulo Costa in that mix. You know, you have all these different potential matchups. All of a sudden, now that you have a new champion in Sean Strickland, the division doesn't look that bad. But for me personally, just looking at the performance that Israel Adesanya put on, and looking at that 5th round in particular where he knows he's down the scorecards and he's just not even going for it, not even looking for a finish, I can't say I think he deserves an immediate rematch. I don't think he deserves an immediate rematch. I want something else. For me personally, if I'm booking the fights, if you guys watch this channel, if you've watched for any regularity, you know I always want merit-based matchmaking. So who's the most deserving title contender right now? And in my opinion, that is Dricus Du Plessis. He melted Robert Whittaker back at UFC 290. He is the clear-cut #1 contender. He is undefeated in the UFC and beat a former champion in his last fight when he was a massive underdog. So for me, if I'm booking the fight, I'm booking Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis for the middleweight title. That is the fight that I want. That's a compelling matchup, and it's a fresh matchup. I'm so tired. In some cases, it makes sense, but I'm so tired of every time a champion loses, we're like, oh, let's run it back immediately. I would rather some time in between. Like think about this. Even if I eventually want to see Strickland versus Adesanya 2 at some point in time, imagine Strickland fights Du Plessis, maybe he beats Du Plessis, and then maybe Adesanya goes and let's just throw out a random name. Maybe he beats Paulo Costa in a rematch or something like that. The UFC gives him a winnable fight. He wins that fight. And then imagine we're a year from now or a year and a half from now, and Strickland's still the champion. Adesanya's won a fight, or even a year from now, and we're getting the rematch. Then we put some time in between it. It makes it so much more compelling because let's just say hypothetically, they're like, oh, well, let's do Strickland versus Adesanya at UFC 300, which is right around the corner. Well, we're just coming off the heels of Strickland 49-46ing him. It's hard to get that out of your mind. Recency bias. You're like, well, why should I be excited for this fight when we just saw it? So, in my opinion, I think the UFC should do Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis, but I do not believe that's what's going to happen. If I had to bet my life, gun to my head, what is the next middleweight title fight? I believe it will be Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya 2. And Dana White hinted at it in the UFC 293 post-fight. He already said, I think that's the fight that makes sense. And Israel Adesanya, there's no doubt that he is a star in the sport. And he's a guy that's been reigning as champion for a while. He had the loss to Pereira. I know I keep mentioning that, but he still feels like a long reigning champion to the UFC and to fans in general because he lost the belt, but he got it right back in the next fight very quickly afterwards. And I just think the UFC is going to look at all those factors. They're going to look at the resume. They're going to look at the activity. They're going to look at the star power, and they're going to say, you know what? Oh, and Dana White already started laying the foundation and the narrative for the buildup of that second fight. Well, Adesanya looked off. He looked in slow motion. I don't know if something was going on with him. I asked him when he was in the cage afterwards, he asked Adesanya, is there something wrong? What's going on? And I already think that Dana White is building the narrative. They are going to book Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya. And we've never talked about it on the channel because it's never been particularly relevant. But in this particular case, and again, I would say I'm 90 to 95% sure that Israel Adesanya will get an immediate rematch, regardless of what fans want. It's because of Dana White privilege. We've never had to discuss that before with Israel Adesanya because Adesanya has been the champion for many years, so there's never really been a case where he's getting special favoritism. But in this case, he is an actual draw. People defend, this guy gets a title shot because he can sell pay-per-views. That guy's getting a title shot because he can sell pay-per-views. Israel Adesanya is a draw. And not only that, Israel Adesanya is active for the UFC. The UFC loves fighters that are active and that will take fights and will just fight 2, 3, 4 times a year. That's why Dana White and the UFC love Israel Adesanya, because he's active. You even heard Dana White in the post-fight presser already taking shots at Dricus Du Plessis and say, look, if you're given the opportunity, you better take the opportunity. Look, Sean Strickland took this fight on, 5-6 weeks notice. Nobody thought he would win. And look, now he's the UFC middleweight champion. And keep in mind, that was a shot at Dricus. That was 100% a shot at Dricus. So I just don't believe, unless Adesanya's injured significantly where he's going to be out for 6-8 months, I do not believe the UFC will book Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis. And even if, let's say hypothetically, let's take the Adesanya rematch off the table. Let's take it completely off the table. Let's say there's no way Adesanya's getting an immediate rematch. I still don't think the UFC is going to book Strickland versus Du Plessis because guess what? Dana White is going to wait to see what happens with Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa in a little over a month at UFC 294. And mark my words, if Adesanya doesn't get the immediate rematch and Khamzat Chimaev beats Paulo Costa at 294, the next UFC middleweight title fight, it will be Sean Strickland versus Khamzat Chimaev. Dricus Du Plessis is third on the list, even though he's most deserving. And I've talked about this so much. And especially in 2023, I've talked about merit-based matchmaking. I understand we don't live in a perfect world. I understand sometimes there's a gray area. But in my opinion right now, I think it is very clear-cut that Israel Adesanya should have to wait. Whether it's fight another contender or sit out for a while and let's see, let's get re-excited for a new matchup for Adesanya at some point because he's been so active. I think the number one contender is clearly Dricus Du Plessis. But the UFC is not going to make it because the UFC is mad because even though Dana White will never come out and directly say this, he expects all fighters to take fights even if they're injured. And I know Dricus, he had a foot injury and he didn't want to take a title fight. And I'm 100% with him. I 100% understand. But I think this is going to be a massive mistake because first off, Dricus Du Plessis, the one that showed up against Robert Whittaker, would have absolutely wrecked the Israel Adesanya that showed up at UFC 293. And that's not to take anything away from Sean Strickland. He had a masterful performance. But I really believe that version of Adesanya, what we saw, and maybe that's the new Adesanya. Maybe that's just him. Maybe he's just declined. Or maybe, we overrated him a bit. But that version of Adesanya, the way he was just backing up against the fence, Dricus's tenacity and his pressure and his physical strength and his grappling mixed in with his power, I think Dricus would have finished Israel Adesanya. So he didn't take the fight. Now he's in the UFC's bad graces, and he could have been the world champion. And even if you take all that out of account, let's just say it doesn't matter. Maybe he would have won, maybe he wouldn't have. And also, let's pretend he's not in the UFC's bad graces, okay? Let's forget about all that. He still made a mistake because now, no matter what, I think he's going to have to wait. Because imagine the UFC does do Strickland versus Adesanya too, okay? Which I believe very certainly this is the next fight for the middleweight division. It's not going to happen by the end of 2023. So it's not going to happen until maybe February, March. I foresee, if I had to give you my official prediction, I would say Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya 2 at UFC 300 in March. That's what I believe will happen. That's the fight that I think the UFC will make because guess what? When you have a long reigning champion who loses their belt, and again, I know semantics, he's not technically the long reigning champion, the UFC really likes to sell those narratives, and Adesanya is the biggest star in the division. He's one of the top stars in the sport. They're going to give him that fight, especially over a Dricus Du Plessis, who they're not happy with, turned down a fight at UFC 293 when the UFC was desperate for a main event. The UFC didn't want to do Adesanya versus Strickland. The UFC didn't want Strickland as champion. But now they have Strickland as champion because Du Plessis was unwilling to fight, even though I'm not saying he should have. I'm not personally saying he should have. So Du Plessis now in a spot where imagine, you have Strickland versus Adesanya in March, okay? March of 2024. Imagine if Adesanya wins the rematch. Guess what's most likely happening there, depending on the outcome? There's probably going to be a trilogy. There's most likely going to be a trilogy. And even if Adesanya wins and maybe they don't do the trilogy for whatever reason, who knows? Khamzat Chimaev is going to be waiting in the wings at that point. And even if Strickland wins again and it's clear cut, Khamzat Chimaev could be waiting in the wings. So Du Plessis looking at potentially he might need to sit out for a year and a half to get his title shot. And that's worked out for other fighters. But I just think, it's not going to work out well for Dricus Du Plessis. Unfortunately, he deserves the shot, but it's just not going to work out well. And I find it really funny, and this is the hypocrisy I wanted to talk about. I think once the UFC announces Strickland versus Adesanya 2, I think UFC fans' heads are going to explode. I'm going to be the first to complain about it, okay? I've made my opinion very clear in this video, even though people think I'm biased towards Adesanya for whatever reason. But fans' heads are going to explode when this rematch gets announced. But it's a massive hypocrisy because it's something that I've been complaining about for all of 2023, basically. You have Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington. Colby Covington was hiding in witness protection, does not have a win over a current ranked top 15 welterweight. He's getting an undeserved title shot. Talked about it in a recent video about how the UFC is slowly creeping towards becoming WWE. You have another undeserved title shot. You have John Jones versus Stipe Miocic at UFC 295 in November. Stipe Miocic is creeping up on 3 years of inactivity. The last time out, he got brutally KO'd by Francis Ngannou and was impersonating a lawn chair. He's getting an undeserved title shot. And now we have Sean O'Malley, who's the bantamweight champion. You have all these different contenders. And instead, he's like, you know what? Let me fight Marlon Chito Vera, who's literally on a one-fight streak. He's on a one-fight streak. I believe he's ranked like number 6 in the division. And a lot of these fans, we're cheerleading these matchups, and I said it a million times. There's always been instances of undeserved title shots. But as the fan base slowly starts to accept it more and more, and there's not enough backlash, the UFC is just going to be more and more willing to do it. And now it's going to be another example where you have Adesanya, who is a star of the sport, and now he's getting preferential treatment. He's getting Dana White privilege because of that star power. And those people who cheerleaded the Colby Covington and the Stipe Miocic and the Marlon Chito Vera title shots, which hopefully that one doesn't happen. I'm still crossing my fingers and praying to the MMA gods that doesn't happen. But people cheerleading that, they're accepting of the UFC's behavior. And now they're going to do it again. And I'm just, for me as a person who watches the sport as a purist, who always wants the person who deserves the title shot to get the title shot, it makes me sick because I can accept it once a year. I can accept it twice a year. But now we're looking at, over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we're looking at a bunch of undeserved title shots. And I do think there is a case to be made for Adesanya. But for me personally, even if you want to give Adesanya, let's say you don't want to have Adesanya fight any contenders. Like I'm acting as if I'm the UFC. And I don't want him to fight any contenders. Do Strickland versus Du Plessis first. And then the winner of that fight can take on Adesanya in the middle of 2024. Let Adesanya sit out for a while. He's been super active. That would be my plan if I was the UFC. Even if you still want to give him that title shot, the Du Plessis versus Adesanya matchup is massive. And that's a fight we may never get now. That is a fight we genuinely may never get now because of decision-making made by the UFC. And it's just super unfortunate. But ultimately, I'm hoping, for some reason, I'm hoping I'm completely wrong. I'm hoping we get Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya, and if Adesanya isn't ready to go by the time they want him to be ready to go, which they will wait for him, I want it to be Sean Strickland, or I think it'll be, not want it to be, I think it'll be Sean Strickland versus Khamzat Chimaev if he wins over Paulo Costa. The best hope for Dricus is that Adesanya can't be ready to go in the next 6 months, which I find that highly unlikely, and then Khamzat Chimaev loses to Paulo Costa. That's the best case scenario because then the UFC has to go with Dricus by default. But that's a lot of circumstances you're relying on to get a title shot when the guy has already earned it on merit. It just sucks when we have all these deserving guys. Belal Muhammad, Shavkat Rakhmonov, both deserve a welterweight title shot. Instead, you're getting Colby Covington. You look at the heavyweight division. Tom Aspinall, Sergey Pavlovich, particularly Sergey Pavlovich, clearly deserves a heavyweight title shot, not getting it instead of Stipe Miocic is getting it. And now you have Sean O'Malley, should be fighting Merab Dvalishvili, clear-cut #1 contender. Instead, you're going to get a rematch with a guy who's on a 1-fight winning streak and got dominated 2 fights ago. And I think history is going to repeat itself. We're going to get Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya, UFC 300, if not at some point in 2024. And it's just unfortunate. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. What do you want to see happen in the middleweight division? Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.